blessed statements are the lessons that we need to take from the book. So, anyone else?
14:13.
14:13. Can you read that for us, Andre? Okay, I will read it then. And I heard a voice from heaven saying, write this, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Blessed indeed, says the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, for their deeds follow them. So, if we're looking and seeing, here are lessons, right? Blessed are those who read aloud this prophecy. Blessed are those who hear. Blessed are those who keep what's written in it. Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Blessed indeed that they may rest from their labors, for their deeds follow them. And by the way, if you're not picking up on this, deeds are a theme throughout this book. How do you know that someone believes? By the things they do. So, other blessed passages. Don't everyone go at once.
16:15.
16:15. Behold, I am coming like a thief. Blessed is the one who stays awake, keeping his garments on, that he may not go about naked and be seen exposed. So what's the blessing on? Those who are always ready. Is that not something that Jesus taught during his earthly ministry, that we should always be ready? You don't know when I'm coming. Others. I'm sorry, go ahead.
22:14.
22:14. Go ahead and read that, Bill.
Blessed are those who do his commandments, that they may have the right to the tree of life, and may enter through the gates into the city.
Okay. You hear that? Deeds, and here the person, and we started the letter saying, blessed are those who hear and keep what's written in it. Now at the end of the letter, blessed are those who do and keep the commandments, that they can have the right to the tree of life and may enter the city gates. I heard someone else. Go ahead, Moy. 19:9. Write this. Blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. And he said to me, these are the true words of God. If you tie that back to Matthew 22, Jesus talked about that there would be a marriage supper that people are invited to. You don't want to show up to that supper without your wedding garment on, because you will be thrown into outer darkness. Okay? Others?
22:14.
20. We had 22:14. Or that is, no, that's, I think Bill had that, but 22:7 if you want to read that. Can you read that, Steve?
Blessed is the one who keeps the words of the prophecy of this book. I think that's the one Bill read.
Oh, okay. I could be confused. I usually am.
So you want me to read 14?
Go ahead. Yep.
Blessed are those who wash their robes, so that they may have the right to the tree of life, and that they may enter the city by the gates.
Okay. Thank you. And the last one is 26, 20 verse 6. Blessed and holy is the one who shares in the first resurrection. Over such, the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and of Christ, and they will reign with him for 1,000 years. So, what themes have you picked up from on the blessed? Who is blessed?
Those that hear and do.
Those that hear and do. Is that not a message in the rest of the New Testament? Yeah? I think the key thing is to remember our deeds, what Revelation tells us is that our deeds follow us to eternity. And they will determine where we'll spend it. Go ahead, Jody.
Now that I have them written down,
Yes.
could you tell me the first one Moya said, verse 14?
So there's 1:3, 14:13, 16 verse 15, 19:9, 20 verse 6, and 22 verse 7 and 22, verse 14. So what I like about that is if you're looking for lessons that we need that apply to us from Revelation, these are clear statements that say that. Okay? So I want to thank this morning, before I start my presentation, I want to thank Dan Kingsley for the pictures that he provided from Ephesus. And this first picture is a picture of the goddess Artemis. And if you remember from Acts 19, there was a big riot because the Word of God had made such an impact in that city. They were rioting because they were the keepers of the temple of Artemis. And so, by the way, you can also see Artemis was in a lot of different places. The Vatican has a statue of Artemis in it. All right. So I want to talk a little bit this morning before we get into the text. In fact, I'll kind of warn you, we may not get to the text until right near the end of the class. But I want to talk to you about hindrances to our understanding of Revelation and the messages. And I want to ask the question, and it's more of a rhetorical question, but is every explanation of Revelation you've ever heard tainted by dogma? In other words, what I'm saying is sometimes we get an idea of what we think the text is about, and when people are doing exegesis, they're literally reading into the text what they want it to say. And you know, we are pretty good about accusing the futurists of doing that, right? Those who claim that this is all going to happen in the future and there's going to be a rapture and it's the premillennial theories. But could we do the same thing? Right? We can. And I talked to you about the historic view, the two of them. Do you remember what they were? If you read my slides, sometimes you can guess what I'm going to say right now. Well, we have two. We have the early date, right? The AD 70, which if you go and you read that, and there's some really good works on this. I recommend looking at Ogden. He's the one that wrote this. He believes that everything in Revelation can be reconciled to Matthew 24. There are others who are late date, AD written after the destruction of Jerusalem, who see in it the fall of Rome. And I will tell you that Shane and I, when we looked at this together, sometimes say, why do you have to choose one over the other? Why can't it be both? Right? It's just... But I think the real question to ask is, are we open-minded enough to actually ask ourselves the question that maybe, did I miss it? Do I truly understand what's in this book? Now, saying that, I'm not discrediting people who spent hours and hours and hours of study on this, because I respect them. Anyone who's done that kind of work has done a lot of work and spent a lot of time in the scriptures and spent a lot of time trying to understand what this message is, because we are blessed if we read it aloud and if we keep it. So it's pretty important, right? But what if we, especially in looking at the messages to the churches, what if we fail to see the message because we're unfamiliar with the Old Testament? Right? I have to tell you that I grew up hearing, what is the restoration plea? That we want to restore New Testament Christianity. Now, I can tell you the people who originally said that had no intention of not knowing the Old Testament. But things lose their meaning over time. And what happens, people tended to say, we don't need to study the Old Testament because the Old Testament that we're not under that. And we ignore statements like Paul said that, well, except our faith, our comfort, our patient endurance comes from seeing the examples that are written there. Those things were written there for our comfort and our education. And so sometimes what happens is we misunderstand things that are said not only in Revelation but also throughout the New Testament. Because when Paul said these holy scriptures are inspired of God and they will lead us to salvation, what scriptures was he talking about? The Old Testament, right? Because the New Testament was in the process of being revealed. If I'm living in Ephesus, I do not have a copy of the 27 books. I may have the letter that Paul wrote to Laodicea. I may have a copy of the letter that Paul wrote to Colossae. If I'm lucky, I may have one of the gospel accounts. I don't have it all. And that's why God gave them the spirit of prophecy, gave them the gift of knowledge, because they didn't have it all revealed. But when they talk about the written word, they're talking about the 66 books of the Old Testament. So when they receive a letter like Revelation, and it makes 400 references to Old Testament scripture without actually ever citing a passage of Old Testament scripture, like where it's from, they know it because they're living in it. Does that make sense? And sometimes we have trouble replicating that. And I would say we don't live in a Greco-Roman culture. You know a lot of things about life, about American culture. Why?
Where we are.
It's where we are, it's where we live, right? And not only that, I think it's less true than it used to be, but you live in the Bible Belt. And the culture here is much different than the culture in Chicago. This is, your religious friends here are probably primarily Baptist and Methodist. If you live in Chicago, it's primarily Catholic and Lutheran, and that's a very different dynamic. But it's also a cosmopolitan city where there are temples, Hindu temples, and mosques, and things like that. It's very, very different than it is here. Not in terms of your day-to-day life, but the people you meet are very different. So what we want to do is make sure that we have enough of a grasp of that Greco-Roman culture so that we can understand more how the people who are reading this letter would have understood it, especially the messages that are written to them. Okay? Any questions about that? So here's another thought to think about. How is John like the prophets Isaiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Zechariah? How is he? What are the similarities?
He's given vision.
Right, he's given vision. But think about how culture impacts the message that he's going to deliver. Right? What did the Old Testament prophets have to deal with? Idolatry, right? It was, for us, this is really hard because we grow up in a Western society where we look back on ancient culture and pagan gods as being ignorant. In fact, our definition, G.K. Chesterton said that the West actually has missed what it meant to be a pagan. Because when we hear pagan, we think devil worship. And he goes, no, pagan culture, G.K. Chesterton said this in the book Orthodoxy, that what he was saying was, they thought they were very religious people. What was it that Paul said on the day at Athens? I perceive that in all things you are very religious. a pagan could be devout to their God. Pagans did things like, and the book, it's really important in Revelation to think about this. You know how every letter uses the word conquers? Do you know what you did if you were a pagan and you had success in your business life, or you had success in your personal life, or you found a wife? You would go to your pagan deity, possibly to Nike. It's not just a sport brand. It's about victory. You might go to Artemis and say, thank you for helping me to overcome. You see how if I lived in that culture and I heard the word overcome, what might happen is, who is responsible for my overcoming? Well, not the message of Revelation. Who helps me overcome? Jesus does. I've got to switch my loyalty from Artemis to Jesus. And John would be trying to give that kind of message. But also think, Rome is the greatest power on earth. But to a Roman, they understood. Parthia still exists. India exists. Romans knew about China. They knew about that. They knew that China was not under their domination. But they had a huge propaganda machine. And what was the propaganda? We're the masters of the earth. No power can stand up to Roman power. You'll see later in Revelation, they'll say, who can fight the beast? If you lived under Roman domination, what would you think? I'm not going to overcome this, right? And so John, like the Old Testament prophets, is explaining to God's people how to be faithful in an overwhelmingly pagan culture and in an overwhelmingly victorious pagan culture. You know, we have just a minute, Shane. We have a similarity, right? How does the world view us? Well, up until last week. But listen, I've traveled overseas. I've been in South America. I've been to Russia. I've been to places like that, and they resent us because our culture is overpowering. Absolutely overpowering. And we export the worst of what we are. You can buy any X-rated, R-rated American movie in Russia. On the street, in kiosk. What do you think they think we are? Yeah. Well, it was similar in Roman culture. Shane?
Well, one thing I just wanted to mention, to just talk about the arrogance and the way the Romans view themselves. We hear this a lot, but what is Rome, the city of Rome, called? It's the eternal city.
Yes.
And that's what was starting apparently around this time. It just gives you a kind of a whole picture, especially Revelation is going to bring that up. And it just ties into their arrogance and the power and how they view themselves.
I will tell you, if you can go to a city, if you can only make one trip, go to Rome. Because in Rome, you see the ruins, and you see all the layers of how long that city's been around, and you get a sense of how powerful it was at one time. Now, to go along, well, one thing I want to make sure is that you also understand the great significance of John to the Old Testament prophets is he's the last one. He was chosen to close out God's prophetic messages. We ignore Revelation at our peril. It's like the last message, right? Here's God telling you, remember Jesus. To me, it's almost like at the end of Malachi, remember Moses, the law of Moses and the covenant. Closing out Old Testament revelation. Here you have God closing out God's revelation, period, until he returns. So I want you to think, though, some more about the importance of this, that, knowledge of Roman culture and history can really help inform our understanding. In other words, so let me just give you a couple of things to think about. Do you know the history of the Roman Empire? Most of us are like, I'm not going through 7 volumes to do that. You don't have to. There are podcasts available on the history of Rome, and somebody will tell you the story in 20-minute increments. By the way, when I commuted in Chicago, I heard most of it there, because I could do 2-3 segments and one way to work. But you learn a lot about Rome and the way the world viewed it. Do you know that the Romans used propaganda, we talk about this, to promote the idea that they're masters of the world? Did you know that Romans and Greeks believed that the world is a sphere? Dan has pictures he can show you of Roman gods, Caesars, with their foot on Trajan. There was I believe this is right, Dan, there was a statue of Trajan in Ephesus, and he had his foot on the sphere of the world. They're shown that from one Caesar to another, he's handing the sphere of the world to the next Caesar. The idea is they're the masters of that. Did you know that the Greeks had calculated nearly the correct circumference of the earth? What do we think? In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and that he was the first one to figure out that the earth was round. Did you know that they had enough certainty about it that it was the Greeks who developed the theory of latitude and longitude? And here's what I think we need to remember. We sometimes are, well, we're not sometimes, we're pretty arrogant. We think the ancients, you can't trust that stuff because, they were idiots. They were not idiots. There's a great book called The History of Knowledge. You think, that sounds boring. It's not. It explains to you why there's something called the Dark Ages. Can you imagine you're in 1200 and you're looking at the Roman aqueducts and you don't know how to replicate that? You have no idea how to do it. I can't even fathom that. Of course, what would that do to your head about the Romans? Wow, they're pretty great. We can't do that. Do you know what the Renaissance is? The Renaissance is the rediscovery of the knowledge the Greeks and the Romans and the Babylonians and the Persians already had. We can't even fathom the idea. What would happen if we went into another Dark Ages and we forgot medicine or engineering? What would our world look like to us? And what I'm trying to tell you is, when you look back at ancient peoples and you ask anyone who's been to, say, an Ephesus or a Pergamum or Pompeii or Rome, the one thing that changes your head a lot is that the first century people were not living in a bad time. They were not. Have you ever seen the floor of a Roman house? The mosaic that used to be in the floor? Or the paintings on the walls? Life was much better than you think. The Romans had figured out, run the sewage downhill and out of town. You could go to the bathroom in your house. That's a pretty... They were more sophisticated, more knowledgeable than we think. Okay? And And I think when we don't realize these things, we tend to read this as, well, you know, pretty ignorant there. Now I want to talk to you, this is from the statue of Domitian that was at the temple of Domitian in Ephesus. And so I want you to think about the emperor cult. What do you usually think about the emperor cult? What are your thoughts when we say worship Caesar? Voluntary or involuntary?
Involuntary.
Involuntary. Well, let me change your mind on that. Asia Minor is the center of these messages. You ever ask yourself, why did John write to Asia Minor? Why did Jesus want it to go there? Well, for one thing, it was voluntary. It was never forced on the provinces. But now I want to put you in the mindset of Asia Minor and the what's in it for me thinking. You have been dominated by the Persians. Remember Xerxes? Xerxes invaded Greece. When Xerxes came, these are Greek city-states that were, and provinces that are in Asia Minor. They joined Xerxes to fight against Greece, against Athens and Sparta. You know why? Because they're pretty practical, right? You're the biggest, baddest dude around. You got a 1,000,000-man army, and we enjoy commerce. Let's make a deal. Then the Greeks, you know, Alexander the Great takes over the world. Well, in the minds of ancient people, those people like Alexander the Great, they're really unique, and they seem pretty special. Is it possible they're a god in the pantheon of gods? They're not as great a god as Zeus, but they could be a god, and they would worship the Hellenistic kings. Now the Romans come along, and they've liberated you, quote unquote, right? And they had councils. And these councils were meant to formulate commercial deals. And they always operated in the best interests of the province. Think of the Chamber of Commerce, okay? And so what better way to ensure that commerce continues except to petition Rome and say to Rome, hey, would you like to build a temple here to the emperor, and we'll be a guardian to it, and we'll make sure that and people here will worship it. It's not that we have to make sure that people do it. It became a matter of civic pride. Okay? And just for example, the 7 churches, here's some examples of what happened there. Pergamum asked Augustus for permission to build him a temple in 29 BC. You know, they did have temples to Antony and Cleopatra. And then Augustus, then known as Octavian, defeated them at the Battle of Actium. Well, things have changed. So let's petition Augustus right now and say, we would like to build you a temple. Or Smyrna requested permission to build a temple for Tiberius and to Livia and to the Roman Senate in 26 AD. And they got it. Dan told me last night that Pergamum also later had temples to Trajan and Livia. You see, they're doing this because it puts them in pretty good with the empire and allows them a certain amount of freedom. It also meant that when you did this, you didn't have to have Roman soldiers stationed in your city. You think you'd be interested in doing that? Domitian gave Ephesus permission to erect a temple in the early to mid 80s of the first century. So, at the imperial temple, because all of us want to benefit from this, you would declare your loyalty to the empire and the emperor. You people would thank the emperor in Rome for their protection and peace. You know, we don't have those crazy Persians over here anymore, and we're not dominated by the Macedonians. Well, they held festivals. By the way, they also kept the Parthians away. Which, if you study the history of Rome, they were always worried about those Parthians out to the east. And then this was a big deal. You held festivals and parades and banquets and imperial birthday celebrations at the temple. You would go there and sing hymns and offer sacrifices to the emperor. And the people, like I said, this is a matter of civic pride. Was it not recorded in Acts that it was a matter of civic pride that the temple of Artemis was in their city? And what did they see Christians doing? They saw Christians, the more people that did that and burned their books to the magic and all that stuff in the streets, what the people saw was, this is a threat to our civic pride. This is a threat to our relationship to Rome. So I want you to imagine you're a Christian and you say, I can't do that because I serve the Lord Christ. It's not the Roman authorities that you're a problem. They could be a problem. But your next door neighbor is going to look at you as disloyal to your city or to your province and to the empire. Do you think you'd feel any pressure under those circumstances to maybe come up with some creative ways you can do it? And let me tell you that one of the messages to these churches is don't assimilate. Right? Okay, so let's talk about the letters to the 7 churches. We've always called them letters, but I think we've already seen what is Revelation as a whole. We've already identified 2 different types of things that it is, or 3. It is a book of prophecy. It is if it's got to be sent to all 7 churches, what is it? Ed talked about this, I think, Wednesday. It's a circular letter. It's meant to go to each of the churches, right? And these letters were sent to the 7 churches. By the way, if you study this enough, you'll have this list in your head. But what's important is, and I don't know if this will work or not, it doesn't, I don't think. Anyway, if you look at that map, the letters are on a circuit starting in Ephesus. And so you go Ephesus, and you go a little bit north, and you're in Smyrna, then you keep going north, and you're in Pergamum, then you start out toward the southeast, toward Thyatira, then down to Sardis, then the last place you would be is Laodicea. So it's kind of interesting that it's almost in a circle, right? It's 7. We talked about that being whole or complete. And it all has the same formula. It's written to the angel of the church. There is a command to the angel of the church to write. And you can see this in every letter. Every letter has an appropriate reference back to chapter 1 and the appearance of Christ. And it emphasizes some feature of that vision, because that feature identifies how Jesus is addressing that group and their needs. Okay? Every letter says, Jesus says, and he starts out with, I know. In other words, Jesus is he knows all about everything that's going on there. And every one of them has a warning or a commendation. He commends them or he gives them a warning. In some cases, he gives them both. Then there's a promise to those who conquer. And then there is a statement, which is very interesting. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the church or to the church is. That's a question. Does it say to church or to church is? Churches. So there's a meaning in that. Yes, there is a specific message to Ephesus. But Laodicea and Pergamum and Smyrna and Thyatira need to know what Christ said to that church, as well as to them and to all the other churches. It wasn't meant like, I'm going to send this off, here's the revelation, Ephesus, here's your introductory letter, and Smyrna, here's yours, and you don't get to see what I said to the other churches. You're supposed to say it to all of them, because there's a possibility that these messages represent the condition of the church as a whole. Right? And not only that, not only are they reading this, but who's reading it today? We are, right? And so it forms a pairing. So if you notice, you have Ephesus, and is the first letter, the last letter is Laodicea. The condition of those two churches is interesting. You have Ephesus, who has left their first love, which kind of says some coldness. Maybe says a lot about coldness. But you get to Laodicea, I wish that you were either hot or cold. Instead, you're just lukewarm. Interesting opening and close, don't you think? The next pairing is Smyrna and Philadelphia. Both of those churches have nothing said to them they need to repent for. They're both faithful churches. One is faithful unto death, and the other is little, but faithful. Right? There's more you can do. Pergamum is an example of great faith in the past, but they're starting to assimilate to the culture. But Sardis was great in the past and is dead. You see the similarities? And then finally, there's the letter to Thyatira, and they really are a mess. But there's a message in Thyatira that says, this is the message that all the churches need to know, and all the churches, 2:23, and all the churches will know that I am he who searches mind and heart, and I will give to each of you according to your works. And it's starting that theme. Works, deeds, things that follow you into eternity. By the way, work indeed is, don't assimilate to the culture, but remain loyal to Christ. You have the problem, but to conquer, you need to repent. You have some things that are good, hold on to that so that you can conquer or you can overcome. Okay? Does that kind of help you as we start to look at each individual letter? To me, this is beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. But it's also terrifying. Because what do we traditionally tell ourselves about the book of Revelation? Well, I don't have time for listening to all that stuff, and Revelation's hard to understand. Here's all you need to know. God wins. And it's a message of comfort to the saints that they're going to overcome in the end. Well, that's a message that Smyrna and Philadelphia can take. But the other 5 churches have a very different message. Overcoming is repenting. Overcoming is stop being part of the culture. Stop making arguments about how I can go over here and put a little pinch of incense on the emperor's altar. I can have, like my Jewish friends, a mental reservation. I don't really mean it. Everyone knows that Caesar's not a god. But you know, to get along with my neighbors and to keep my job, I'm just going to go over and do it. I mean, you got to live in the real world, right, folks? Why do you think I made that point?
We could fall the same trap.
We can fall into the same trap. I'd already say we may already be in it. We're going into a world, folks, that's very different. And remember, I worked a job. In some cases, it was my responsibility to help enforce HR policy. Are any of you going through re-education in your HR departments about what you must not say and what you must not do and what not only not tolerate but accept? Yeah, I see a lot of heads nodding. Our world, especially for those who are my age or older, we grew up in a very different world. Christians were respected. When I was dealing with a recruiter in Chicago, I sat in a meeting where myself and the provost were, he was Presbyterian. You know what I am. And the people around that recruiting table said, we do not want to hire any more people like you two. Out loud. And the recruiter said, can I have coffee with you after this? And I said, sure. And she goes, you know, the only form of discrimination that's acceptable right now is against Christians. Now am I talking, do you see the relationship here between why these letters are important and why revelation might be important in our daily lives? Probably more so than we think about. So, we're going to dive into Ephesus and Smyrna probably Wednesday night, but I thought it might be worth the time to just kind of level set here and help us understand what we're about to see. So, I want to go ahead, Jody.
I'd just like to add one more thing.
Sure.
You're talking to the choir here.
Yes.
Our kids in our government schools, they are absolutely bombarded and indoctrinated now. You can't say anything about anything without being hate or prejudice. They don't use that word. I'm losing the words that they use.
Can't use hate speech.
Well,
Right.
but we can't say anything that implies anything. Any biblical moral, we're called out on.
Yes. I would say, folks, that one of the reasons why I think this is so important, if you know, I worked for 26 years in higher education. 26 years. I was an administrator the last 5. If you think that your children are going to go to a public university without encountering this, it will not be presented as an interesting thing to do or an interesting way to think. It will be presented to them as the only intelligent way to think. And that if anyone thinks any differently, they're not intelligent. Do you think for a moment that that's not really hard on a young adult? Not only will they think it, it's very similar to what we just discussed here. Not only will the administration and the instructors be pushing it, and they won't come out and just say that, folks. They're gonna present it as here's how it should be in the world. And wouldn't any reasonable person think so? And what what will come out is, I was that age. How impressionable were you when you were that age? And what did you think about peer pressure? Because of all of your peers believe it and accept it. If you don't think so, think about what your attitude toward homosexuality was growing up, if you even knew anyone that was. And what is the attitude of younger people toward it today? They don't see it as a problem in the culture. They see it as that's part of the culture and that's the way things are. So, cultural assimilation is real. And by the way, I'm just going to say this, and I'm going to give equal time. But if you listen to CNN, you're culturally acclimated to one, and if you listen to Fox, you're culturally acclimated to something else, and that's why we have the problem we do. Right? You can pick your culture you want to be acclimated to. How's that helping the church? No. Right? So, we're going to stop there. Wednesday night we'll begin here.